All right, so again, we're diving into some pretty intriguing stuff today. Those cell phone calls from passengers on 911 flights.
Oh,
You know, the
yeah.
ones we all heard about right after the attacks.
Hmm.
Heroic calls,
Yeah.
full of emotion, but what if they weren't actually made from the planes? That's what we're going to explore today.
Right.
Back then, cell phones were totally different, way less powerful.
Oh, yeah.
So could those calls even have happened the way they were reported?
Yeah, it's definitely a puzzle worth exploring. Those calls became a huge part of the 911 story.
Right.
But when you look at the technology of 2001, let's just say it raises some serious eyebrows.
Okay, so paint the picture for me.
Yeah.
What was it like trying to make a cell phone call from a plane back then?
Okay, so imagine this. You're cruising at 30,000 feet, going hundreds of miles per hour.
Okay.
Cell phones in 2001 relied on ground powers.
Right.
And to stay connected, your phone had to rapidly switch between those towers as you flew by.
Yeah.
It's like trying to catch a baseball being thrown from a speeding train.
Right.
It was already tough enough to get a signal on the ground,
Yeah.
let alone up in the air.
And there were experiments proving this right.
Exactly. A Japanese TV show actually tested this in 2003.
Oh, wow.
They took cell phones on a plane, and guess what?
Right.
Calls started dropping out at just 8,000 feet.
Wow.
Nowhere near the altitude of a commercial airliner.
So if it was almost impossible to make a regular call from that high up, how did these 911 calls supposedly last so long? Some were reported to be over 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest red flags.
Yeah.
We have detailed FBI reports with interviews from the call recipients,
Right.
and the length of some of these calls just doesn't add up.
Hmm.
Take Thomas Burnett on Flight 93. He supposedly made at least 2 cell phone calls to his wife from over 30,000 feet
Wow.
while the plane was still climbing.
Still climbing.
Then there's Jeremy Glick, also on Flight 93, who reportedly had an 18-minute conversation with his wife while the plane was rapidly descending thousands of feet.
Oh, my.
His wife described the call as crystal clear, almost as if he were right there with her.
Hang on. Clear audio while plummeting from the sky at those speeds. Seems pretty far-fetched, even with today's technology.
Right. It makes you wonder if these calls were actually coming from somewhere else entirely.
And that's where this in-flight swap idea comes in, right?
Exactly. Some researchers suggest that maybe the passengers were taken off the planes and forced to make those calls under duress.
Wow.
It's a chilling thought, but it would explain a lot of the inconsistencies.
So you're saying it's possible those emotional goodbyes, those last messages weren't even happening on the hijacked planes?
It's a possibility.
That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
What about Todd Beamer's famous "Let's Roll" call? Wasn't that from Flight 93?
Well, that call has its own set of problems. According to the official timeline, the hijacking happened around 9:28 a.m.
Okay.
Beamer's call to the operator is believed to have started around 9:43 a.m.
Okay.
But in the call, he describes events as they're happening in real time, like the hijackers storming the cockpit.
Mhm.
If the official timeline is right, those things would have already happened 15 minutes earlier.
So either the timeline's way off or he's describing something that already happened, almost like a script.
It's a strange discrepancy, isn't it? And here's another odd detail.
Okay.
The operator reported that the call lasted almost an hour, even staying connected after the plane crashed.
What?
Airphones rely on the plane's power?
Right.
How could that even be possible?
Okay, the more we dig into this, the more questions pop up. If those calls weren't from the planes, where were they coming from? And why would anyone stage something like this?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And to really understand what might have happened, we need to take a closer look at the role of the media and how these calls were presented to the public. That's coming up next.
All right, so we've established there are some major question marks surrounding those 911 calls. But why would anyone go through the trouble of faking them in the first place?
Well, yeah, it's not like making prank calls, right? This was a national tragedy. The
Right.
stakes were incredibly high. And that's why we have to consider what someone might have to gain by creating this narrative
Right.
of heroic passengers making calls from doomed planes.
So what are we thinking? Some kind of elaborate cover-up, a way to control the story.
Well, one possibility is that it was a way to manipulate public opinion. Imagine the country reeling from the attacks, everyone desperate for answers.
Yeah.
And some sense of hope. These calls, presented as genuine, could have been a powerful tool to rally the nation behind a particular response.
Okay, I can see that. These calls painted a picture of passengers bravely facing their fate, even fighting back. It could have easily fueled a sense of patriotism and a desire for action, but wouldn't people eventually start questioning the whole cell phone thing?
Yeah,
I mean, it's not like that technology was a secret.
of course it was a gamble. But remember, the immediate aftermath of a tragedy isn't exactly a time for calm, rational analysis.
Oh,
People are
sure.
grieving, they're angry, they're looking for someone to blame, and also someone to lead them.
So you're saying that in the midst of all that chaos and emotion, it might have been easier to pull something like this off.
It's possible.
That's a pretty disturbing thought.
It is unsettling, and it raises the question, if those in power were willing to manipulate the story around these calls, what else might they have been willing to do?
That's a chilling thought. It makes you wonder about the whole idea of never letting a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
Could these calls have been used to advance a specific agenda?
Some researchers believe so. They point to the concept of controlled opposition. The idea that by creating the illusion of resistance, you can actually control the narrative even more effectively.
Okay, break that down for me. How does faking heroic phone calls equal controlling the opposition?
Okay, think about it this way. If you present a story of passengers bravely fighting back against the hijackers, it creates a sense of hope, even defiance.
Right.
It can distract from the bigger questions, the questions about security failures, about who was really responsible. It becomes a story of individual heroism rather than systemic failure.
So instead of asking those tough questions, how did this happen? Who's to blame?
Right.
People are focused on the bravery of those on board.
Exactly. It shifts the focus away from the people in power and onto a narrative that, while tragic, ultimately reinforces the status quo.
Wow, that's a whole other level of manipulation. It's almost like a magician's trick.
Yeah.
Distract the audience with something flashy while you're doing something sneaky behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And remember, we're not just speculating here. We're looking at the evidence.
Right.
The technical impossibilities, the inconsistencies in the official narrative, and trying to piece together a more complete picture.
That brings us back to the media,
Yeah.
because they played a huge role in how these calls were presented to the world.
Absolutely. The media was our primary source of information back then. And the way those calls were reported with all the emotional details, the final goodbyes,
Right.
it undoubtedly shaped how people understood the events of that day.
It's like those calls became this instant symbol of the tragedy, but also of the resilience of the human spirit.
Yeah.
And while that's a powerful message, it also makes you wonder if the media perhaps unintentionally contributed to a narrative that wasn't entirely accurate.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. On one hand, journalists were under immense pressure trying to make sense of a horrific and rapidly unfolding situation.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we have to acknowledge the power of media narratives, the way they can shape our understanding of the world. And in this case, the narrative of heroic calls, while emotionally resonant, might have obscured some crucial inconsistencies.
So what you're saying is that we need to be media savvy, right?
Yeah.
Especially in times of crisis.
Yes.
We can't just take everything at face value.
Right. It's about recognizing that the media, like any institution, is not immune to bias, to influence. It's about being critical consumers of information, about asking tough questions, and being open to the possibility that what we're being told might not be the whole story.
And sometimes the most important questions are the ones that make us uncomfortable.
Right.
The ones that challenge our assumptions
Right.
and force us to rethink what we believe.
Exactly. That's where true understanding begins.
Yeah.
In that space of discomfort, of questioning, of seeking truth beyond the accepted narratives.
All right, so we've talked about the technical problems with these calls, the potential motives for faking them, and the role of the media. But where do we go from here?
That's a great question, and I think...
Wow, it feels like we've gone down a serious rabbit hole here.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's a bit unsettling.
Yeah.
We started with those heart-wrenching calls from 911, and now we're questioning everything.
It is definitely a lot to process, but remember, the goal isn't to create confusion or doubt for the sake of it.
Right.
It's about seeking the truth, however uncomfortable it may be.
You know, it's interesting because when you really think about it, this whole situation highlights a much bigger issue.
Mm-hmm.
The importance of critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Not just when it comes to 9/11, but in all aspects of our lives.
Absolutely. Especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides, it's more important than ever to be able to sift through the noise and figure out what's real, what's spin, and what's outright manipulation.
We've all heard the phrase, do your own research. And this deep dive really shows why that's so crucial.
Mhm.
You can't just passively accept what you're told, whether it's from the government, the media, or even so-called experts.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's about being an active participant in the search for truth. It's about questioning assumptions, looking for evidence, and being willing to change your mind when presented with new information.
And sometimes that means challenging deeply held beliefs, even if it makes us uncomfortable. I know that for a long time I took those 911 calls at face value. It was a powerful story, and it felt good to believe in the heroism of those passengers.
Yeah, I understand. It's human nature to want to believe in the best of humanity, especially in the face of tragedy. But sometimes the truth is more complex, more nuanced, and it requires us to dig deeper, even if it means challenging our own perceptions.
So if we're going to be more critical thinkers,
Mm,
where do we even start? Are there any practical tips you can offer our listeners?
absolutely. One of the most important things is to diversify your sources of information. Don't just rely on one news outlet, one website, or one social media feed. Expose yourself to different perspectives, even those you might initially disagree with.
It's like getting a second opinion from a doctor.
Right.
You want to make sure you're getting the full picture.
Exactly. And when you're evaluating information, pay attention to the source. Who's presenting this information? What's their agenda? Are they relying on evidence or are they just pushing an opinion?
And speaking of evidence, it's crucial to look for it. Don't just take someone's word for something. Look for facts, data research that supports their claims.
Right. And if you can't find any evidence that's a red flag, it doesn't necessarily mean the information is false, but it does mean you should approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
And one last tip. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If something doesn't make sense, if you have doubts, don't just brush them aside. Ask questions, do your own research, and come to your own conclusions.
That's the essence of critical thinking, the willingness to engage with information actively, to challenge assumptions, and to seek the truth, even if it's messy and uncomfortable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into those 911 calls, I think the biggest takeaway for all of us is that critical thinking is not just an academic exercise. It's a vital skill for navigating the complexities of the world, for making informed decisions, and for holding those in power accountable.
Well said. And remember, you have the power to question, to seek the truth, and to make up your own mind. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and remember, keep those minds curious and those questions coming. Until next time.